Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
There are more stories to be found in the national park system than one could write in a lifetime, or several lifetimes. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. Sometimes those stories can be hard to spot. How many were aware of the factoid from Great Smoky Mountains National Park that Jennifer Bain dug up? That if you stacked all of the park's salamanders against its roughly 1,900 black bears, the salamanders would weigh more. Talk about national park trivia. I knew Great Smoky had salamanders, but really, more in pounds than the park's black bear population? We're going to talk about stories in the parks today with Kim O'Connell and Rita Beamish, two long-tenured writers for The Traveler. The ones they're currently working on are pretty interesting. We'll be back in a minute with Kim and Rita.
Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smoky's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smoky's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smoky's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokyslife.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Hi, Kim. Hi, Rita. Great to see you guys again.
Nice to see you.
Hi, Kurt. Hi, Kim.
So, as I mentioned in the introduction, there are countless stories across the national park system, and you guys have been digging around for years, as have I, and you come across these amazing stories. And then, there are amazing stories, and there are interesting stories, and there are historically significant stories. Kim, let's start with the story that you've been working on now, revolving around historic Jamestown. What's that story all about?
Well, it's interesting that you started talking about trivia because I was trying to think of some interesting factoids from Jamestown, and I'm sure I will have some in the story when I finish it, because the number of artifacts that have been excavated there, it numbers in the millions. And some of the things they have found there as a historic site, the archaeologists, are just remarkable. Things like crucifixes and pipes and really cool things. I assume that
when you say pipes, you're talking about smoking pipes, not plumbing pipes.
Yes, smoking pipes, and just things related to historic Jamestown, which I assume everyone remembers from their history books is the first English settlement in North America. And as the site likes to say, it's actually where the very foundations of modern America were first laid. It's a really interesting site. It's in Tidewater, Virginia. As I've talked about in our podcast before, I'm in Arlington, Virginia, and I'm just outside Washington, D.C., and we call that Northern Virginia, but Jamestown is in the Williamsburg area down in Tidewater, Virginia, not too far away from the Atlantic Ocean and Virginia Beach. It sits along the James River, which is an iconic historic river in Virginia, and which I'm sure has the same root as the name of the town, Jamestown, the very first English settlement, a permanent English settlement here in North America. I do want to not take anything away from the lost colony down in Roanoke Island and that important story. But Like many coastal sites up and down the eastern seaboard and really across the country and the world, Jamestown is basically sinking because of sea level rise. And so I got to go down there and see for myself what was happening. It's something I've heard about for a long time, but it was pretty astonishing to see evidence of this incredible historic resource literally going underwater and what that means for these incredible artifacts that are there. So that's what I'm looking into right now.
I'm curious, Kim. It's been there for centuries, and it's been studied for probably at least a century. Don't we know everything there is to know about Jamestown? And so, what's it matter if it goes underwater, so to speak?
I mean, that's a really good question, but I don't think we know everything there is to know. How could we until we know the extent of what's there? And there are so many layers to this site, literally layers, because it is an active archaeology site going back to the first settlers of the 1600s, to indigenous people. Then you have all those layers of settlement after that. There are remnants of a Confederate fort from the U.S. Civil War there. They find evidence of 17th and the 18th century pottery there. And what I find particularly interesting about Jamestown, which I don't think was covered very much in the history books when we were all young, is that it was a diverse society. I mean, you think about the coming together of white European immigrants and enslaved Africans who first arrived at Jamestown in 1619, and indigenous people, the Powhatan and other tribes that were indigenous to Virginia. They were coexisting in various ways. And all those layers are sort of commingled there at Jamestown. And so, yes, they have uncovered a lot there, and there is a lot that's already known about it, but there's more stories to be told. And then what I also think is worth remembering is that our means of understanding archaeological artifacts keeps changing with new technology. So, what an archaeologist or a scientist or a historian might have gleaned from an artifact 100 years ago might be different than what they can glean from it now and maybe 100 years from now. So we need access to these resources because our understanding of what's happened there may grow more sophisticated over time. So it's, I think, very important that these uncovered resources remain intact until these researchers can sort of get to them and understand what they are.
I'm curious, and I'm sure many of our listeners are curious too. Is the problem that the land is sinking, or is it sea level rise that's raising the water levels?
Well, I'll give you that classic SAT answer, which is D, all of the above. So there is land subsidence happening. There's land that's sinking. The river, which is close to the ocean, so it's a tidal river at that point. Sea level rise is raising the water levels, and that's impacting the site. What I write about in the piece, which I found particularly interesting, is Jamestown sits on an island, Jamestown Island. And, it's sort of mostly an east-western oriented island, but the southern shore of it is along the James River. And 100 years ago, a seawall was constructed to protect the historic resources from the water so that the water wouldn't encroach on this site. And what's remarkable to think about is that even over 100 years later, for the most part, that seawall is holding. That seawall largely is still protecting this site from overwash or too much sea level rise from the James River directly, even though the edge of the fort is right there on the riverbank, like it's right there. What is happening is more insidious. The water kind of is coming in from the back. It comes in from the edges. The water table underneath the site is rising because of sea level rise. And what's also happening is that the ecosystem there in Jamestown is changing. So, historically, when the village was first created, there was, drier upland areas, there were marshes, there was a swamp that sort of threaded through the middle of the island. Well, those boundaries are changing. Like the swamp is growing. So whereas where the main archaeology happens on this site, the swamp used to be some distance away. Now, for some of the archaeology pits that the staff there have created, the swamp is almost up to the very edge. It keeps expanding. So you would think that it's the river breaching the seawall and lapping up over the site that's causing the problem, but it's actually kind of almost encroaching from behind or from within, which is really interesting. And then, when they literally do digs, they don't have to go that far down before they hit the water table, which did not used to be the case. And so that means that there are many, many archaeological resources that are already underwater and maybe permanently so.
Yeah, I'm curious. Last year you went down to Cape Hatteras National Seashore to do a piece on the houses that were falling into the ocean, and when those houses were built, they were like 200 feet away from the surf line. Is it kind of the same thing at Jamestown, that when the village was first established there, it might have been 100 feet or something from the river? Or
it's not as dramatic and obvious the way it is on the barrier islands down at Cape Hatteras, but the shape of the island has definitely changed, and really the internal structure of the sort of ecosystem has changed. It's the bigger issue by far is that the edges of the swamp and the marshlands are what keep encroaching and changing, more than the overall size of the island. But that has certainly evolved over time and shifted and changed its location. So, but that seawall that was built, I think it was built like maybe 1901 or very early in the 20th century, it really has held pretty well, which is pretty remarkable. And also the way they built it, it doesn't encroach on the view towards the James River, which is really critical for the historic experience there. And one of the things that the Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation, which runs that site primarily, has talked about is, they could raise the seawall, but at some point, if you just make a wall too high, you're going to change the visitor experience completely. So they're trying other things, or they're talking about other things to sort of make the site more resilient in the future.
But if it's underwater, it ruins the visitor experience as well.
There's that. And actually, when they do have flooding events, most of the area impacts where visitors walk. Like there's the main walkways, whenever they tend to be low lying, just the way the site was developed over time. And when they do have a flooding event, you can't walk on the pathways. It's already impacting the visitor experience.
Do they know what's causing the subsidence?
I'm not real sure about that exactly. Like I need to do more research about that.
Yeah. It's curious. I mean, we've heard that with climate change, we're seeing different impacts, whether it's sea level rise or whether the continent is sinking to a certain extent along the edges. Pretty fascinating. Who's doing most of the research there? Is the Park Service involved?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. There is co-management happening at Jamestown Island. It's a really interesting historic site overall in Tidewater, Virginia, because you have Colonial Williamsburg and you have Colonial National Historical Park, which is a National Park Service site. And then you have the state of Virginia has an attraction there called the Jamestown Settlement. And then you have the historic Jamestown, which is what I'm talking about, which is run by an organization called the Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation, which itself is part of Preservation Virginia, which is the state's primary preservation organization. And it's managed in partnership with the National Park Service. So all of Jamestown Island, or most of Jamestown Island, is owned and managed by the National Park Service. And historic Jamestown is just like a little corner of the island, but they sort of co-manage the site for visitors. There's one visitor center for both the Park Service owned property and the Preservation Virginia owned property. But I have to say that as far as I could tell, like the vast majority of energy around protecting these resources is coming from Preservation Virginia and the Rediscovery Foundation. The Park Service seems absolutely aware of it, and they're probably certainly doing their own mitigation measures. But I would say, from my perspective, that the foundation is taking the lead on some really important work down there to try and protect this site.
Yeah. I'm curious, as an aside, not related to the story you're working on, but some years ago, there was a big battle over putting transmission line towers in the James River. And the last I seem to recall was the courts ruled that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was wrong in issuing the permit. And supposedly the transmission corridors were supposed to be taken out. Any idea? Are they still there, pretty visible?
I didn't notice such a thing, so I would have to look into that, Kurt. I actually felt like the view from Jamestown was pretty unmarred by development for the most part, and that is pretty remarkable in an area that's not that far from Virginia Beach, and it's only an hour away from Richmond, and only a couple more hours away from Washington D.C. and some really developed areas. That little spot at Jamestown, I feel like a visitor really could still go there and sit on the edge of the fort site and look out at the James River, which is nice and wide there close to the ocean, and maybe imagine what it might have been like to be there in 1607. So we'll see what happens. I know there's always development pressure, but for the most part, I feel like that was a pretty interesting experience.
Yeah, sounds really interesting. Rita, you're working on a very topical, hot button story, if I might call it that, about the Endangered Species Act. What's that all about?
This is a story that starts with the Trump administration's efforts to dramatically shrink government. What we are seeing is at first, they tried to fire all the seasonal employees or stop hiring them. And then came the wave of probationary employees who were summarily fired. There may be, and that, as you know, is weaving its way through the courts as to different judges have said that's illegal. The Trump administration is appealing. At the same time, some workers are being restored who were probationary. So in all of this, we are seeing a lot of stories about the tragedy of these workers losing their jobs, like just on short notice. They came in that day, they were out.
Just to interrupt you, Rita, this is a constantly evolving story. It's amazing how quickly it's evolving. The other day, the Traveler had a story that the Park Service said, well, just wait, and we're going to have some direction from Washington on exactly who to rehire. And 24 hours later, it said, okay, we're going to break those probationary employees into two groups. The A group, or kind of what you might call the public-facing members of the Park Service, employees of the Park Service, the law enforcement rangers, custodians, park guides. And then there was the B group, which I'll say natural resource personnel who are working, studying stuff in the backcountry or monitoring resource damages, audiovisual people, maybe even social media staff, you don't know. And the understanding was that those people would be brought back for a temporary period, 45 days, and then probably be riffed. 12 hours after we got that message, another memo came out from Washington that they're supposed to rehire all of them and bring them all back in. So it's a constantly evolving situation, and we still have reduction in force plans, which are supposed to be finalized in April. So it'll be interesting to see what those show. Didn't mean to interrupt you, but it's constantly changing and timely, so our listeners know what's going on out in the parks.
Yeah, thanks for summarizing it, Kurt. I was just going to reference that same thing, that much as this sort of this up, down, an appeal and another judge's ruling, the employees are all nervous about what Trump has publicly said will be a round of reduction in force terminations. So even when you get reinstated, you're never quite sure where you stand. That all said, that's not really the essence of my story. It's more what's promulgating us to look a little deeper. And so beyond the visitor experience in our parks, with worries about long lines and overflowing trash and bathrooms not cleaned, my story is a very big look, starting with sort of an ecosystem approach, but yet also it comes down to a very a tiny focus, as something as small as an insect or a plant, which are listed species on the Endangered Species Act that are threatened or endangered. So with every one of these employees who worked in the natural resource realm, which not all do, some of them are gatekeepers, taking money at the entrance of a park. There are some habitat and species stories behind that. So what my story is doing is trying to learn what is the impact on our our most delicate and oftentimes rare, most vulnerable species, both plant and animal, by this disruption, which has already happened. The probationary people already have been off duty for, since February 12th or so, February 14th, maybe. And that has had some impacts already. In other cases, as we know in the natural world, maybe not everything happens suddenly. This could set in motion some things like lack of interruption in monitoring, or something that would take a little bit longer to recognize. So this is what I'm trying to explore. And there's different elements to the story, which in some cases involve closing, termination of leases, or closing of buildings, where, for instance, an interagency team works on a listed species, like the grizzly bear recovery team that works in Bozeman, Montana, at the I think it's called the Northern Rocky Science Center. Apparently, that building or lease will be terminated. And this is a disruption in years of interagency efforts of people working together on the issue of grizzly bears around the Yellowstone area. That's just one example. I already an immediate example of an impact that is going to be felt perhaps any day, is that we did post a story about already, was the case of the Maui forest bird recovery project in Hawaii. These are it's a half a dozen of species of honeycreeper birds. And in Hawaii, birds are very special culturally. They're rare, they are endemic. Some birds are found only in Hawaii, and it just has a very rich heritage, and environmental concern and respect for the bird populations, as with much of the ecology in Hawaii.
That's at Haleakala National Park, right?
Yeah, the Maui Bird Project is involving Haleakala National Park and kind of the surrounding areas. But just by way for context, Hawaii had something like 113 endemic species of birds at one point in history, before humans began to intrude on their habitat. And there's something like 71 of those species have gone extinct. So when we're talking about the birds that are left, it's a pretty big deal. And the project that's underway, and that got a big shot in the arm from the Biden administration, is to attack the main threat to the birds right now is avian malaria that's spread by mosquitoes. And the project is using male mosquitoes that they're bred in a lab in California, trucked over to, or sort of, I don't know how they get them on a boat or a plane or whatever. They bring them to Hawaii. It's just an endeavor in itself. But they're infected with a certain bacteria that, when they mate with the females in Hawaii, it renders the eggs, the eggs don't survive. And this has to be done. They have to release these mosquitoes every week, like thousands of them, to try to change the trend of the flourishing of the mosquitoes that are carrying the malaria. So that project's underway, and their money has been frozen by the Trump administration because it came from a couple of pieces of legislation from the Biden years, the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure package. And those two have been targeted, as I understand it, by the administration for freezing until they can review for compatibility with an executive order. And so it's money that's already allocated, but it's a big problem. And I was told that the project only has a few weeks left to be able to pay for this to continue the release of the mosquitoes. Now, this is a case where if you interrupt that, and I'm not sure exactly, but it could be, you miss a week or two or a month or, a couple of months, they can reverse all of this progress. So now that's money down the drain, that they were making progress on trying to save these birds from dying at the hands of the mosquito bites. Not to mention that there's natural predators and everything, but and habitat encroachment. But in this case, it turns out that the avian malaria is the big threat right now. So that's going on Maui and also on the island of Kauai at a refuge. They've started it more recently, the same program. So that is just one example of how an interruption in money or in reduction in staff can really have a dramatic effect.
I'm wondering, there are so many moving pieces that we're talking about here. We're talking about freezing of funding. We're talking about trying to reduce the federal workforce by getting rid of probationary employees. We're talking about the Endangered Species Act. You know, if you take a look at Project 2025, that conservative blueprint that was written up before the election last year, it called for weakening, if not totally dismantling, the Endangered Species Act. Any idea, is that what's going on? I mean, do all these pieces fit together into a bigger puzzle?
Well, I think the dismantling of the Endangered Species Act, Trump is and his helper, Elon Musk, depending on how you want to look, who's helping who, they have a big assist from the Republican-led Congress right now. And this, before the Trump administration took office, this was a big concern in the environmental community that all of these executive actions could happen around the edges or directly, but ultimately they could be ruled illegal by the courts if they violate the Constitution or if they violate the law. Now, the Endangered Species Act, of course, is one of our most powerful environmental laws. It's very powerful. And this was the concern that if the Republicans got control in Congress, they in fact would take that apart. And it's really been a long held wish of many Congress members to take it apart. And yes, so we're already seeing introduction of legislation that would in fact weaken the law quite a bit. It is a Republican-led Congress, so I suppose we could say that has very good chance of passing. And it would take away quite a bit of the power of the law as it stands now, because right now, if a species does get listed on the endangered species list as either threatened or endangered, there is a whole chain of actions that the government is supposed to do. You monitor it, you protect its habitat. You could even take extreme actions to keep it from going extinct, such as captive breeding, which we had of course, some very famous successes. The California condor was saved from extinction in a captive breeding program. I think the black-footed ferret, same thing. They have a continuing captive breeding program for the ferrets, and I'm not sure, there may be some impact on the location where they're doing that from some of the cuts. I am not remembering exactly what was going on there, but it's possible. So all of these kind of activities are all under the umbrella of saving a species from going extinct. As you know, especially in the habitat area where a place is decided to be habitat for a listed species, that means a lot of things can't happen there. It could be agriculture, could be mining, could be road building, and this is where it has become a very powerful law in being able to block things like that. Now we can, I think, if in weakening the law, I think we can expect to see less habitat protection, frankly. So this fits right in with what the administration wants to do on public lands around national parks, which is a lot more energy development and mining. And those practices can impact, even within park boundaries, the species, because as we know, the habitat doesn't stop at the boundary of a park. It goes to the adjacent BLM, Bureau of Land Management lands, or the forest. So I think this whole package of initiatives from the administration and with the help of Congress, you could see some real trouble coming down the pike for the Endangered Species Act and the listed species. And by the way, probably it's going to be very hard to get any new species listed. There's many species out there that are having a rough time, plants or animals. And, but you got to go through a lot of research and proof and science that this is deserving of being listed to gain all of those protections that I just talked about. That's probably going to be very difficult to have in this climate, have any species listed.
You know what's going to be interesting? The other day, the Interior Secretary and the Agriculture Secretary had a joint announcement that they were going to open up public lands to housing. Now, they didn't specify what public lands. I'm sure it's not going to be inside national parks. At least I would hope it wouldn't be inside national parks. But you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of acres, hundreds of thousands of acres of BLM lands and U.S. Forest Service lands. When you're talking about critical habitat for species, a lot of national forests surround national parks. BLM lands in the west and the southwest surround national parks, and that provides a buffer of sorts for endangered and threatened species. You start talking about opening up these places to housing, and you just have to wonder what the impacts are going to be.
Yeah. And, I think I mentioned, that I was thinking of this in terms of a large ecosystem approach. And I think a lot of people don't realize that there's over 1,000 plants that are listed as endangered. Well, why is that important? Why do we care if this or that flower or tree or, it becomes extinct because the habitat is dry, or because they build housing there, right? Something like that. Well, for instance, in Shenandoah National Park, there's a very voracious vine. I think the name is the Oriental Bittersweet, that can just grow like crazy and crowd out native species. And it can climb up into trees and their canopy, and it's so big and strong and it grows so fast, it can actually topple trees. And so why this is important in Shenandoah, and again, I didn't say this directly, but, culling out and fighting off invasive species is a big part of habitat protection for our listed species. So in Shenandoah, they have many very delicate native plants, and they're a very specific ecosystem that nurtures the animals, the creatures there, including the endangered salamander and an endangered bat. And if you have this vine coming up on the rocky outcrops where a lot of this very delicate and natural vegetation grows, now you've lost the nourishment for your species. I mean, it's also, I can't overemphasize, how interconnected these ecosystems are, and the change in soil chemistry can make that just by one type of invasive, like a hardy grass that can outgrow natives after a fire, that changes the soil chemistry, and now it changes your environment, and then you just have this ripple effect. So I always like to tell people, because I think a lot of folks don't understand the very delicate balance in a habitat, the importance of having our top predators like grizzlies and wolves in their natural habitat, rather than killed off because they're not compatible with agriculture or something like that. So the plant world is extremely important here too. And that's when you mentioned housing, I was thinking, well, that's exactly the kind of thing. But it could be tortoises, it can be marine species. Fish are a big part of the endangered world as well. Different kinds of fish that are outcompeted or even eaten by invasive fish. So it goes on, and there's dozens and dozens of species that are listed, in addition to the plants, over 1,000 plants, as being, they could go extinct, is basically the point, if we don't take all these steps that were outlined in this half-century-old Endangered Species Act that's been on the books all those years and has been protecting these species.
Now, the Park Service is in a a difficult spot, is it not, with the change of administrations? And what I'm getting at, and I think you ladies have encountered it, is there's incredible resources in the staff of the National Park Service. There's so much knowledge there, and they explain things so well. There's practically been a blackout on National Park Service personnel being able to talk to the media. They don't have a Senate-confirmed director of the National Park Service. They don't have a chief of communications in Washington. Every question goes from the park level back to Washington, D.C., and it comes out in a 2 or 3 sentence statement that says absolutely nothing. I'm not blaming the Park Service for this. I'm blaming politics for this. But have you guys encountered that kind of, I'm not going to say it's pushback, I'm going to say a lack of help from the agency in trying to report on your stories, whether it's Jamestown or endangered species, but at any other angle?
Yeah, and I want to point out that it's not only the Park Service, because my stories, of course, involve the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is the big agency with our endangered and threatened species. It's also involved the U.S. Geological Survey, which also gets involved in various species, aspects of species involvement. So yeah, and as you said, I have reached out to people in the park, in the local region, people I've dealt with in the past, and they're usually in the press office, and they're very comfortable to tell me, oh, I'm going to get that scientist or that biologist, hook you up with them, and you can talk to them about it. It's been, a number of years now. They don't really like it when you try to reach out directly to their scientists. And those people have all been told, well, just let, the press office know that you're going to talk to a reporter. But now it's a completely different. Yeah, it's, not completely different. It's just orders of degree, no commenting. It goes, as you said, to the regional office. It goes to headquarters. You may or may not get that note back that says we have nothing for you on that, or some kind of pablum that is just a non-responsive, and or nothing at all.
A perfect example, Jennifer Bain, when she visited Great Smoky Mountains earlier this month, she couldn't get Park Service personnel to help with her story on salamanders. Kim, what have you run into?
Well, the exact same thing. And I think about the irony of us being the national parks traveler. And I feel like we're rapidly moving toward a situation where we will be covering the national parks without ever quoting from the National Park Service. That's what it often feels like. And again, I don't blame the rank and file staff. They are doing a lot of important work in often really difficult political environments. But what I find interesting and what makes me distrustful about some of these government efficiency initiatives is that efficiency would make you think that it would be easier to get information from a federal agency. But somehow, despite all these efforts towards greater efficiency in the federal government, we are getting less information as Americans and as American journalists from our public agencies than ever. So what is wrong with that picture? I increasingly find that my best luck on any story I write about the national parks is talking to anybody but the National Park Service. I hate to say it. I wrote a piece that was published in the Traveler last fall about the aftermath of Hurricane Helene and the economic impacts on all the gateway towns. And it was incredibly refreshing to write a national park story where I didn't really have to talk to Park Service personnel. I was talking to regular folks. I was talking to Chamber of Commerce officials and tourist development people and citizens and things like that, that are all impacted by the national parks. And I feel like that might be the way our coverage will have to go. We'll have to rely on friends of national parks organizations to give us information, or people who work with the national parks in some way. And again, here with Jamestown, it just so happens that this co-management situation exists there, that we have a nonprofit organization that's from a state nonprofit working alongside and with the National Park Service. And that's how I was able to get this story done, because talking to the National Park Service largely hit a roadblock, although they did get back to me recently via email, like we're talking about. But in terms of working with a nonprofit, they were like, yeah, sure, come on down. We have lots to share with you. They just don't have the same level of bureaucracy and the kind of baked in stonewalling that I think we've been seeing. Like you said, Rita, not just from the National Park Service. I don't want to just beat up on them. I just think there's a bureaucratic stonewalling that's happening, and I think it's dangerous. I mean, the free press is part of the First Amendment, and when journalists can't do their jobs because the message is controlled so tightly, I think it's a little bit concerning. So yeah, you got me on my soapbox, Kurt. So
Can I like to chime in here. What I'm finding though, Kim, is different this time. Because it was more of an annoyance factor in past administrations where they wanted to control the message, and the press office would always be like, Rita, you need to talk to us first before you try to talk to other people. And they may or may not be super responsive. What I'm finding, there's a culture of fear out there among these government agencies, and it is spread. Now, in Hawaii, my understanding is the state agencies, well, they've been told to refer everything to the federal agency when there's a lot of interagency work, right? So the state Department of Natural Land and Resources I could usually go to them for information about the mosquitoes and all. They're not talking. Even the friend groups, my understanding is they are afraid because they don't want to be targeted. If they speak up and are critical, we need our money. They took our money. But there is a fear throughout the system. Part of it is because probationary people who were fired, they want to perhaps make sure they can get their job back if the courts and everything comes down their way. Other people, perhaps they don't want to have anybody looking at them with a reason to fire them. So there's this fear element that it's of course frustrating to us as journalists, but you can kind of understand it because there's a retribution ethic going on. It's no secret. It is, it's out there. We see it. Don't poke your head up because you're going to get dissed publicly at a minimum.
I wonder where all this is going to lead. It's only been 2 months with the new administration, and trying to predict where they're going with this is impossible because it changes rapidly. And some have told me that they're more than happy not to talk about anything, and so it's a real disservice to the American people in so many different areas, whether it's national parks or national forests or the VA. Department of Transportation. It's frightening almost.
It's a government trying to act in secrecy that gives the impression that they just don't care if the people, either doing the people's business allegedly, but we're in journalism, of course, we're all about transparency. So that's been a pretty big change that there's not even lip service to that. That's what I'm saying after many years of covering policy in the government.
It's going to be interesting to see where it goes. We've got some exciting stories coming up. Some are tied to current events. How is national park visitation going to be affected by the administration's angering of other countries, of possible recession going on? We've got Minuteman National Historical Park in Massachusetts next month kicks off what could be the first step in celebrating the 250th anniversary of the country. Minuteman National Historical Park interprets and protects the first site of the first Revolutionary War battle. So we're going to have a writer going down to view that reenactment, and it'll be interesting to see what type of help he gets from the Park Service in terms of those stories. And then there's a lot of endangered species stories that we're going to write regardless of what happens to the Endangered Species Act, but it's just one thing after another. And there's a lot of generic visiting the park stories, and it's so valuable to get the help from the National Park Service in explaining those stories. It's definitely a time that I've never encountered in my professional career.
I do think also in a very big picture way, it's going to be interesting to see where the signals that are coming out now actually lead in terms of priorities. Will the Park Service, how will they fulfill their mandate to preserve and protect these natural resources for future generations when there are things that already seems like they're not doing that. You don't just, fire people without, evaluating their role and call it protecting, fulfilling your mandate. So what we'll have to see about that. Could it be that a smaller staff can do all that work? I think we know what we think about that, but I think that's what I'm going to be really interested to see is how do they explain their faithfulness to the mandate down the road.
No, absolutely, because the National Park Service Organic Act of 1916 gave the Park Service specific mission going forward, and protecting the resources was primary. Making sure visitors had a good time was secondary. Federal courts have upheld that mandate time and time and time again. What we're seeing today with employee hiring in the parks involves park protection and national security, and to ensure the public has a fun time in the parks. Well, what about the natural resources? That's the primary mandate of the Park Service. And so, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm just wondering if the reduction in force really hits the park staff that monitors and protects natural resources, if they are let go, will that trigger a lawsuit that, it's in violation of the National Park Service Organic Act? I mean, can it rise to that? I don't know.
I mean, it goes to scientists, researchers, monitoring. And what about maybe you could make a case that an interpretive ranger is fulfilling the mandate by helping people understand that why do I need to stay on the path and not step into this area where there's an endangered butterfly? I got it. So it can ripple out pretty far throughout the Park Service Park Service workforce, in terms of who is actually fulfilling that mandate directly.
And I was going to say it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the courts, but there's also like the court of public opinion. I feel like one thing that's always unified people is a love of the national park system. And when it gets politicized like this, I saw in a comment feed, don't ever go to comment sections during this fraught time, but I went to his comment section talking about impacts to the national parks of the current, Doge cuts and that kind of thing. And someone said, well, what's the big deal? It's just a couple visitor centers that have shortened their hours. No parks have closed. I thought, okay, for that person, they haven't hit the tipping point yet. But I feel like for most Americans, there's a tipping point with the national parks. Everybody loves the national parks. Like, where is that line when we've gone too far, and maybe the parks will be the thing that everyone unites around? I could see that possibly being one of the places where people come together, maybe who are divided in other ways, because there is such a common love of the parks. And I just wonder if things will go too far and these parks will suffer too much, and that maybe that's just too Pollyanna right now, but that I'm just curious to see how the public reacts to ongoing cuts and pressure on the national parks in all these ways we've been talking about.
Yeah, I know initial polling has shown that the public is not happy with the reduction in force across the federal government, and we'll see what happens with that. And we'll see if anybody in Congress has a backbone to stand up and say enough is enough. We haven't seen that yet. I don't know what the tipping point is either.
And I think, I was thinking about Congress too, Kurt, before you said that, that in the past, as you know, the Congress members have wanted to really protect their own park and the ones that their constituents are, going to all the time. And also the ones that are big money makers for their gateway communities. So we know that Congress and, even conservative kind of budget cutter types it could be quite protective of the parks. But as you say, it is a new climate, and there's a lot of fear push back on the part of politicians. And so I think perhaps ultimately it will be, who are they getting more pressure from? Their constituents or the White House to vote a certain way. And that those are bridges to be crossed and sort of watchdogged over these coming months.
Definitely concerning times, and hopefully the flip will be sooner than later, back to the old way, because we love writing about the fun things in national parks, the exploration, the wonderment. We'd much rather write about that than how many employees are getting cut and what the impact's going to be.
And we like to be right in our stories, so we would like the government to tell us the actual, the details that we're looking for.
Never let the facts get in the way.
Yeah, there's that.
Well, Rita, Kim, thanks so much for joining me today. It wasn't the most lighthearted conversation that we've had in recent years, but I think it's important to let the listeners know what we're trying to deal with as journalists and what the impediments are. Not that we're turning our backs on these stories or on the Park Service. We're just struggling to get the cooperation of the National Park Service in telling these stories.
Thanks, Kurt.
Thanks.
And that's our show for this week. I hope you found it informative. As always, we'll be keeping track of the hand the National Park Service is being given to operate with, and hopefully we'll see a director nominated by President Trump in the near future. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.